I used to sit in a dead girl's chair in fourth period history. Her name was Cassie. She was a grade above me, so I didn't really know her. I remember everyone at school being freaked out at her death. It's not common for people to die so suddenly around here, especially kids. Even now, as an adult, deaths like that aren't very frequent. Some depressed asshole decided he wanted to take some people with him, so he'd cut through the grass and sped down the opposite side of the highway. He plowed his pickup into Cassie's family van at 100 miles an hour, head-on. Killed all four of them instantly. Wasn't even anything left to bury. Horrific shit. When I got older, my dad told me that he'd been driving home from work and passed by the crash. He said he'd never seen so much blood before. My dad owns a butcher shop, so that surprised me to say the least. Cassie's death still bothers me to this day. The way she went out just doesn't sit right with me. A whole human life, full of potential, snuffed out in an instant because a suicidal guy couldn't afford a pistol. How is that even remotely fair? There's murderers, rapists, abusers that walk free, living their garbage lives and not facing any consequences, while Cassie and her whole family had to die. Shit like that gets to me. I don't think I'll ever forget Cassie. Not because of who she was in life. Like I mentioned, I didn't even know the girl. But her death impacted all of us for a time. Longer than even I expected. I found out that she died during fourth period history class in my junior year of high school. I was sitting in the back corner, a spot I tended to prefer in most classes. Quiet, out of the way. And I could sneak looks out the window to daydream. I wasn't the most popular kid in high school, so I only kept company with a small group of friends. Unfortunately for me, none of them had history with me, so I usually stayed quiet. Mrs. Sanders came into class that day looking a mess. Her makeup was smeared on her face, and she kept a bundle of tissues clenched in her left hand. She'd obviously been crying hard on the drive here. The whole class quieted down when she came in, fearful of what news she had that made her so broken up. She set her purse down on her desk, then made her way to the front of the class. "Class, I have an unfortunate announcement for you all," she said to us through sniffles. "Your upperclassmate, Cassie Angstrom, has passed away." The class had mixed reactions. A few started sobbing, either because they knew her or because they were just sad about a death so close to home. Most, including me, looked around at each other, not recognizing the girl's name. After Mrs. Sanders calmed down, class carried on as usual with lessons on the Civil War. I couldn't focus. For some reason, all I could think about was Cassie. How come barely anyone knew her? I could excuse myself for being an introvert, but it confused me that barely anyone could remember the girl. I couldn't even put a face to the name. A few days later, still clearly grieving, Mrs. Sanders told us a bit about Cassie. She was a quiet girl, she told us. Didn't talk a lot, which is why many of you may not have known her. But she was one of the brightest students I've ever had. She took this same class with me last year, just like you all. She sat right back there. She pointed right at my seat. It really shouldn't have bothered me. It was just a coincidence. She could have sat in any chair in that room, and it just so happened to be mine. But seeing everyone's head turned towards me made my spine crawl. I had an exam in third period the next day, so I was late to history. Mrs. Sanders was already lecturing when I walked in, so I rushed over to take my seat. When I sat, I felt a wet squish on the seat under me, like I had sat on a cake. I sighed, thinking it was a prank from some jock, but when I got up, there was nothing there. No mark on my pants or anything. I got up and touched the chair with my hand, and it felt normal. People were starting to look at me, so I quickly sat back down. The same thing happened again the next day, a wet squish when I sat for the first time. I even stayed after class to check under the seat for something, but it looked normal. It continued to happen, but I just started ignoring it. I assumed it was something to do with how old the seat was or my pants material or something, but I didn't give it much thought. On the drives to school, I would pass by the place where the accident happened. There wasn't much money going around in my town back then, so they hadn't done the best job cleaning up the spot. There were still large red patches on the asphalt, turned dark by the sun. I tried not to look whenever I passed. Sometime a few weeks later, I felt the wetness in a different spot this time. I was taking notes for our test that Friday, and I felt something slick and soft brush my hand. I immediately recoiled, dropping my pencil on the floor. My skin crawled from the touch, my nerves standing on their ends. The wetness wasn't even the worst part. I had gotten used to that from sitting in the chair. It was that it was cold. Like freezing cold. And again, just like the chair, there was nothing there. I had begun thinking that I was sick or something. Like something was happening to my skin or organs that was causing these sensations. I got a checkup that weekend, and the test came back clear. I was healthy. That next week was finals, so I stayed late at school to study. I was always more focused when I stayed at school to work on stuff. I would always get distracted if I studied at home, either from my own antics or those of my family. I picked my history room to study in, mostly because it had the largest windows. They would usually shut off the lights after hours, so I used the sunlight to read my textbooks. Naturally, I picked my usual seat. The wet squish was gone this time. I noticed immediately, now feeling uncomfortable, that the familiar sensation was gone. Odd how that happens. I had sat in the seat earlier in the day, so maybe the metal wasn't as stiff. I just shrugged to myself and got out my materials. I stayed for a few hours, getting as much studying done as I could before the janitors would eventually kick me out at 9. It was around 8:30 when I felt it again. That wet brush. I jumped even harder than last time, forcibly pulled out of my flow state. My heart was racing, and I glanced around the room to see if anyone was there. Nothing. I took a few moments to calm down, breathing hard and closing my eyes. When I opened them, I saw darkness. It took this scare to make me realize that I could barely see my notebook, and I had been squinting in the darkness for the past 30 minutes. The classroom was covered in shadow, with the posters of dead presidents' faces barely visible in the dark. Starting to get creeped out, I took this as my sign to finish up. When I reached to close my notebook, I felt it. A cold, wet slop of what could only be described as flesh draped on my shoulder. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. And God, I could smell it. I recognized the smell from my times helping my dad at his shop. It reeked of rot and decay, and I could feel streaks of putrid liquid falling down the side of my jacket. I was frozen. I couldn't move. I felt a deep chill form at the base of my spine and crawl to my nape. The previous touches had unnerved me and made me jump, but now I was truly terrified. I could feel its weight pressing on my shoulder, seeping liquid onto my skin underneath. The smell was unbearable. I looked over, and I could vaguely make out what was touching me. It was barely visible in the darkness, almost transparent under the shallow glow coming from the streetlight outside. It was a slab of dark red meat, thinner towards the tip. What seemed like bones stuck out from one end, and blood was dripping out of tiny holes on the surface of the flesh. I heard a deep, guttural sound behind it, like someone gurgling water. It continued for a moment, and I could faintly make out words behind the noise. "That's my spot. I keep seeing this background character on anything I watch. I have this hobby of watching kids' shows, even though I'm nearly in my 20s. I don't know why, might be my autism or something, but I just like it, and that's all there is to it. When I get home after a boring day at school, I'd go to my room and watch anything available on my TV. Basically whatever is on Netflix, Stan, YouTube, and Prime. It just makes me feel nostalgic again. Everything was all good until he appeared. I don't know who he is or what he wants, but even if he doesn't mean any harm, I don't know if he can trust it. It happened 1 week ago. I was watching an episode of Arthur, can't remember which one, with a hot plate of garlic bread and a cup of Pepsi. Midway through the episode, I noticed something in the background. It looked like some kind of character, but all I saw was just a black stick figure, standing behind a tree and observing the characters. I couldn't see him very well because of the show's quality, but I ended up shrugging it off. Must have been a small animation error. But last Thursday changed my mind a bit. I was in my bedroom once again. I was taking a break from the god-awful homework assignments, and to kill the boredom, I decided to watch Detention Air. Watching cartoons always put me at ease. It helps relieve stress from everyday life. Then I saw him again, peeking behind a corner, but I could see this character clearly this time. He looked like he was wearing pitch-black clothing. His white skin was so bright that it almost looked like it was glowing, and his baggy eyes were a pale pink, no bloodshot eyes. I only got a good look of this character because as soon as he appeared, I paused the show and examined him like a captured wild animal. As I looked at this thing, I could already feel something was very wrong about him. It wasn't that he didn't match the show's art style or his design felt Tim Burton-esque. There was another feeling. Dread. I snapped out of our staring contest as my mum called me to take out the trash. I shook my head and looked back at my ajar door, calling back that I was coming. Then I looked back at my TV and, as you would expect, gone. "It's nothing, I'm just tired," I said to myself quietly, getting up as I leave my room. I wish that was the answer. I really do wish that this character was a result of my mind being an asshole to me. On Saturday, my uncle came over for a barbecue dinner my mom and dad hosted. My uncle really loved crime drama shows, especially Breaking Bad. Tonight, I saw him watching Better Call Saul, and honestly Saul Goodman was my favorite character. I never really liked drama shows, but I give both Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul exceptions. I was in the living room, watching an episode, and I was getting sleepy, so I prepared to get off the sofa when I noticed someone. He was just sitting in a chair, like he was waiting. As we made eye contact, something then hit me. He was never observing any of the characters, he was observing me the whole fucking time. "Hey mate, you okay?" my uncle said, noticing me freeze and staring at the TV so intensely. I shook my head and excused myself, fast walking to my bedroom. The sightings kept getting more frequent. I saw him in shows like Teen Titans, Futurama, DuckTales, Aqua Teen Hunger Force, Seinfeld, yes, even that, I'm not joking, and so many more. He was always hiding in the fucking backgrounds. And just as I thought I was going insane, it all suddenly stopped one morning. I was watching My Little Pony, I know, deal with it, and I expected to see him again, but he never showed up. I checked other shows, but he was never there. I was relieved, but when I went to the kitchen to make myself breakfast, my dad comes in and asks me if I left the living room TV on last night. "No, I didn't. Why you ask?" I reply, with a funny little smirk. "Well, someone did, and all that was on the television was just plain old static," my dad replied. "Weird," I said, still jokingly, but at the same time, I felt a little unnerved. This brings me up to last Wednesday night. Me and my parents were having dinner at a pub, and we unexpectedly meet one of my dad's many friends, and he wanted to do a selfie with us, so we did just that, although I was hesitant. When we got home, I get a notification from Facebook that my dad's friend just had posted our selfie, so I went to check it out. My dad, mom, and the friend are making dumb, silly faces, while I was closed-mouthed smiling. This photo looks perfectly normal. Wait, who is that? I looked closely at the background and I nearly let my phone slip from my trembling grasp. He was behind us, outside the pub, peering through the glass, staring into the camera and at me. Any of my family members, or friends, haven't noticed him, like I'm the only one who can see him. My TV in my bedroom hasn't been used in a while. I don't want to get rid of it. My dad did give to me after all. Just 2 days after the night at the pub, I was home alone with my dog Max. He's a Kelpie, and I still couldn't get the image of the character out of head, so I basically locked me and my dog in my room, fearing that he might be in the house. Not even a minute later, he begins to whine and growl at the door, but no one tries to open it. No jiggling the doorknob, no knocks, nothing. This went on for 2 minutes before whoever was outside my bedroom walks away. I could hear faint footsteps going downstairs. I've also locked the window and closed the blinds, just in case. Whoever, or whatever he is, I hope he leaves me alone soon. There's something in the woods at Synergy Park. I've been carrying this burden for a long time, about a decade now, and I'm ready to get the weight of what I saw in 2014 off my chest. Maybe I'll finally be able to leave my house without receiving venomous glares from my neighbors and the other locals in my small town, if they actually heard my side of the story. It was my first summer back from college, where I skated by with a 2.8 GPA. You can probably already guess, I did not graduate. I moved into my mother's new house in the small town of Kilgore. This town wasn't far from where I grew up, and I had quite a few friends here already that I had met through high school sports, or around bonfires at pasture parties. I got a part-time job as a bartender to support my underage drinking, and that would allow me to hang out with friends through the summer. My little job also introduced me to the well-to-do people of Kilgore. I had many long conversations with the mayor, several city officials, most of the business owners around town, and my personal favorites, the newly divorced women of the community. They told me all the dirty little secrets of the town, including the group of swingers who lived in the rich newly developed neighborhood, and how several of locals were on a government watch list that I probably shouldn't air out here. The most interesting rumor, though, came from Mrs. Doherty, an 83-year-old grandmother that was still popping with life and liked her margaritas with a double shot of tequila and on the rocks. I didn't mind serving her that much. She would make suspect remarks about taking me home with her, but I just smile and sometimes even flirt back with her. She did tip well after all. One relatively quiet evening for a bar and grill, she was my only customer, so I kept her company, and she told me a story of when she lived with her grandfather. My grandpappy came here during the oil boom. He was a rich man from back east. He owned coal mines in West Virginia. She began with a snap of pride in her voice. He bought a few thousand acres just northeast of town in hopes he struck oil himself. He never did. But we had a large farm, and my daddy had more than enough land for hunting, so they were happy. He was about your age then and had me a year later, she said through her thin smirk. But when the war started, I was 11 and Daddy got drafted and sent to North Africa, then Europe. My grandpappy was too old to hunt, and I wasn't allowed to leave the yard yet, but we began having animals go missing. I bet it was jaguars. Weren't they still around this part of Texas in the 40s? I blurted out, a little too excited to show off my knowledge of the area. No, she replied, still smirking. They got hunted out of these part by then. This wasn't a cat. Her smile faded a bit. The carcasses weren't right. They just weren't right. She trailed off, obviously still scarred by the gruesome scene. It got our longhorns. And when we found them, they had been torn to pieces. Even a bear couldn't do what we saw. My grandpappy took me home, and he got his double-barrel 4-bore rifle he took on safaris. It was made for elephant hunting. Whatever was out there scared him, and I ain't never seen that man scared until that day. He stayed up all night in the pasture with the rest of the cattle for a few nights, sleeping the days away. The last night he did my mama, grandma, and I heard him shoot 8 times at it, and we heard that thing howl out twice. I'll never forget the sound it made. There was nothing natural about it. My grandpappy came crashing through the kitchen door a few minutes after, pale as a ghost and shaken from head to toe. I was little then, but I remember seeing him bawling on his knees, pointing that monster rifle at the locked door all night like the devil himself was about barge in. Did he ever tell you what it was? I asked, pretty shaken up myself at this point. No, honey, he never did. The next day he sold the land for pennies, cows and all. We bought a small plot in town. He forbid us to ever go out there again. And now that land is Synergy Park, right? The industrial park with the fishing pond and walking trails? I asked hesitantly. She nodded. Her smirk turned to a somber smile before checking her watch and realizing it was 9:30 p.m. well past her bedtime. She gave me a $100 bill and gently clasped my hand, telling to keep the change before making her exit from the bar. I was stoked. She only had a $30 tab, and I got huge tip and a pretty spooky story out it. Before long my manager came out and gave me the go-ahead to take off due to our only customer at the bar, Mrs. Doherty, leaving, and I kindly obliged. I got in my truck feeling pretty good. I made over $100 in tips, mostly thanks to Mrs. Doherty, and still had enough time to hang out with friends. I called my buddy Parker, who I knew would either be trying to find a girl to hang out or buying weed. Either of the two would be fine with me. Dude, where are you? You working tonight? I just got an eighth of straight-up gas from my boy. You want to drive down Long and Windy and blow some trees, dude? Parker choked out through fits of coughing. Yeah man, I just got off, I'll come pick you up. I got Parker in my truck, who was clearly already completely inebriated, and we started making our way to the back road the kids in town called the Long and Windy. After several bowls of admittedly strong kush, I somehow remembered that I had left my 44 mag revolver in the center console. My heart sank a bit, knowing if I were pulled over I could possibly lose it, and it was a gift from my dad for hunting. Dude, we gotta turn around, I gotta put my gun up, I said, eyes redder than a fire truck, and my speech slowed to the point of sounding like I had special needs. Nah, fuck that, dude. Your mom would totally flip if we showed up with eyes looking like Satan's nutsack, Parker said. Yeah, and I don't have eye drops either, I admitted. I just won't get pulled over. It's not like we're speeding anyway. Then I remembered what Mrs. Doherty had told me and relayed the story to Parker. Bro, that's trippy, dude, let's go out there. Parker blurted out, his speech slurring at this point. I agreed in an equally embarrassing, stoner response. We stopped by a gas station where a girl named Tabitha worked. Parker knew her from high school and knew she would sell us beer. Are y'all sure you should be drinking? Tabitha asked, genuinely concerned for the other driver on the road and definitely not us. We're going out to Synergy Park to drink, I said, throwing a package of hot dog wieners, charcoal, and lighter fluid on the counter next to the 30-pack of Miller Lite. You want to come hang out when you get off? We've got enough bud and beer to share, I said. Well, my genitals were really doing the talking at this point, in all honesty. Tabitha smiled and declined the offer, saying she had to be up early for something. I zoned out after the rejection and stopped listening to her rambling, and now was furious. I bought the hot dogs, and my plan to get her to hang out with me failed. I didn't even like hot dogs. But quickly I was over it, and more interested in traumatizing Parker's stoned ass in the woods. The main gate to the park was closed, but the east truck entrance stayed open all night, so we slipped in that way and took the industrial drive back towards the camping and fishing area. We parked, loaded a bowl, and cracked our fourth beer. We stumbled down a few walking trails, all the while I mockingly made jokes about the beast of Synergy Park to Parker. He was howling laughing, until realizing his beer was empty. Bro, we need a refill ASAP, and dude, let's get them dogs on the grill. Yeah man, might as well, I said in what barely sounded like English. We found a camp grill near where the truck was parked, poured in the charcoal, and soaked the briquettes with lighter fluid. We gave it 10 minutes before lighting them, grabbing another beer and rolling a joint in the meanwhile. We were absolutely crossfade by this point, yet somehow I managed to grill the perfect dogs. And even though we forgot the buns and condiments, we devoured most of hot dogs regardless. With several wieners left, and now half the 30-pack gone, we had just started to deck in from the cannabis high to solely buzzed from alcohol. That's when we heard it. It sounded like a prehistoric monster, mixed with a woman's shrill screech behind it. Parker jolted closer to me. Dude, what the actual fuck was that? He stammered out, obviously scared witless. I don't know man, maybe it's a cougar? They scream when they're in heat. While that is true, I had no idea what that actually sounded like, and this wasn't a scream. It was unnatural. I had never heard anything quite like this before. Then the noise came again, louder, and now it was closer. Hey man, get your gun just in case. Parker sounded more sober than I've ever heard him sound before. I grabbed the revolver from my truck. We need to be loud, and meet it with authority. We're the ones with the firepower. This is just an animal that wants a meal, not a fight. If we show some resistance, I promise it'll back off, I queasily told Parker in hopes of reassuring him. He nodded at me, the look of absolute fear in his eyes, and his nod of confidence in me is what breaks my heart the most today. The creature came swaggering through the trees. It wasn't a mountain lion. It wasn't a bear. It was something giant and ferocious, and unnatural. I never got a good look at it. All I know is it was big. I never saw its face through the blast of my revolver, but I know I hit it at least 4 times. I heard it scream and roar in pain from the 240-grain lead projectiles slamming into its chest, neck, and shoulders, It never slowed down. It was as if I just shot a grizzly with a BB gun. I pissed myself in terror before it swept me aside like I was a gnat. My head was driven into a pine tree. I heard my neck and spine crunch and crack. A wave of hormones and endorphins permeated my body. Then came the anaphylactic shock. Before passing out, I realized I couldn't feel where my ass or legs were, and I watched as Parker was dragged away into the woods. I passed out shortly afterwards. He was crying and screaming for help the last time I saw him, and the look of abject terror on his face will haunt me to my last day. I was found the next day by the police. I didn't know what to say to them about Parker. I just pointed in the direction he was taken and wept uncontrollably, and kept weeping until the surgeon sedated me to unconscious. I was trying to save my legs. For a month the police claimed I killed Parker in the woods that night, until DNA evidence proved I never even touched him, and the fact that a now paraplegic couldn't have torn him into pieces the way he had ended up deeper in the woods. But that didn't stop public perception. It seemed everyone in town blamed me for Parker's death. It was a hard pill to swallow, confined to a wheelchair, and called a monster at the same time. It was too much. I've become a recluse in the decade that followed Parker's death. I just couldn't handle the judgment, or the guilt of not being able to save my friend. I don't know what attacked us that night, and some part of me will always wonder, but I'll never. I just can't go back to Synergy Park, not while knowing that thing is still out there.